to create a more competitive space. And this is a section within the site of Times Square. Our section shows the circulation that were started to design within the building. It was our focus to create new ways of circulating so that each of the users and retreat goers are able to choose their own adventure, as well as ways of getting lost within the vertical office retreat. We selected one pathway that a retreat goer could use, where they have a mix of workspaces, which would be used for training and other task-based activities and leisure areas.
We are depicting one way of accessing the building by highlighting 3 chunks. This is the first chunk. Just like the game of Chutes and Ladders, we implemented areas where the players could cheat or escape out of the other spaces and get into a desirable volume. A player will approach the building and come into the lobby, noticing the pink marble and wood volumes first, but are unable to access them immediately. They'll go up the elevator to start participating in the retreat.
As they get out of the elevator, they will go into the assembly area where they gather to learn how to participate. From there, choose your own adventure. The players will go into the other work volumes, requiring them to receive some training, where the player will choose if they want to try to achieve a promotion by playing the most efficient or taking time off within the leisure spaces.
Choose your own adventure and choose carefully. Players have 4 different options after learning the rules in the assembly space below. The 4 different options here lead to another work volume, a rock climbing wall, a theater space, and a casino. Some may think that they are winning when they don't have to participate in work, but in reality, those that are spending time in the leisure zone will be delayed from completing the building. This perspective is of the basketball court from the office. The workers will have to decide to either engage in the office requirements to then go into the leisure space or complete the tasks slowly. Within this space, promotions can occur where they are left behind because of their lack of productivity and then exchanged to become the boss of the others. In this space, someone who has struggled with motivation within their job can succeed by losing the game previously.
This is showing the next chunk in the context of the building. We're highlighting the creative studio and rage room as leisure spaces. Added around the leisure volumes are the chute-like slides where the players can slide down from the office into one of these leisure spaces. In the office or leisure, relationships can be made and understood. Aspects of the office illustrate role reversal, which allows users to understand other roles in the office, potentially for more compassion to the other workers. These are the last 2 leisure spaces, which are the sleeping pods and an AR and VR room.
As we proceed through the building, we find ourselves within another workspace filled with people trying to typing away on their computers. The time remaining is 3 hours and 43 minutes, and the ticking clock constantly gives the users anxiety and stress. Someone quickly completes all the tasks and a loud buzzer goes off, just reminding everyone that they are not as good as the others. As the winner sprints ahead, they think they are winning and end up sliding down into the creative studio. The winner is now stuck painting on a canvas while the sound of others moving on ignites a feeling of stress and panic. The winner tries to get out without completing the task and pushes through the rage room opening. Now the user is really frustrated. The ever present knowledge of others moving out of the workspace and into another starts to agitate the winner even more. The other players in the leisure space seem to have no problem completing the task, but in Rage Room, they all need hands on deck to escape. With no exit in sight, they start to swing away. Meanwhile, they start to understand each other and feel like they are cooperating to get a better outcome for those that have been stuck.
This is the last chunk that is highlighted. We highlight the reading nooks adjacent to the work volume. which is nested to the nightclub and held up by the indoor skydiving space. Within the nightclub, people are starting to feel a sense of relief momentarily until they realize they have two more work volumes to get through. The feeling of pressure for the promotion dies down a little bit as they start to enjoy dancing with their coworkers. As the players emerge from the workspaces at the end, they are left to leave the retreat, hopefully with some appreciation for the week.
As they leave, they have a sense of hard work, but also with rewarding experiences that range from forming relationships to understanding others' employees' work or a new way to cheat through their 9 to 5. They find themselves back in their home, awaiting another week of work, hoping that the new relationships they formed will translate back into the office. The alarm sounds for 7:45, with some hope of a better work environment after the retreat. We are back in the office, knowing how to compete a little better, but also have some new people to collaborate with for new projects. The retreat better sense of understanding of each other, whether it's new friends or new enemies. Maybe this makes the work a little bit more cooperative. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Hello?
Hi.
Can I say something just as maybe an introduction to this conversation? I cannot not help recalling the 60s. Yeah, the late 60s. I mean, that's my generation. Excuse me if I say that. And we did, you know, we did study architecture in this kind of a world where we were trying to question reality. What is reality? What is an object? What is our relation to a chair, to an office also? So I see a great deal of revival here in terms of subject matter, because you're really criticizing, yes, the working space, yeah, and see how there are other possibilities. In the 60s also, if, you know, I would like, you know, I'm not nostalgic in that respect, you know, but you know, it's the graphics, your project in all aspects recalls work produced in the 60s. If at time I could show you drawings made, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, and you will find a tremendous amount of similarities. In a way, I'm suggesting you to study them, yeah, to look for the sources, because you will feel that you're not alone, whatever that means. Second, at that time there was a great deal of interest for pop art. I don't know if that means anything to you, but yeah, it came from the arts, not from architecture. Yeah, architects kind of looked, at galleries. I made a trip to New York City to see these exhibits by Rauschenberg, by other, New York City artists, on West Broadway, yeah, in galleries. So the idea that a chair can become an artificial form, object, yeah, that resembles grass, for example, yes, the softness of grass, and you try to design that. So it's also this idea of a semiology, yes, yeah, what an object communicates socially and also individually. So all this, yeah, and also the connection with leisure, yes, leisure. A lot of work was about getting together with other people, yeah, through music, theaters, all these things. So again, I'm kind of surprised to see this revival, yeah, in a way, but maybe it's about time. I mean, you're raising questions, and yeah, it's kind of intriguing. It's very interesting in that respect. Yeah, for example, in the 60s, you have collages, depicting Santa Claus, with a gun, yeah, and not, bringing you presents, yes, hello, things that were provoking your relation with, with reality, the way it's being presented to you. So I think this is fantastic. I just wanted to say that. Yeah, thank you. Also, sorry, the selection, the graphics is kind of toyish, yeah, because also in the 60s, they were looking at comics, the illustrations of comic book, all this. In other words, the idea that in architecture, there would be all these disciplines or experiences that were merging could affect architectural space and architectural form. So I see this kind of toyish quality in your drawings, playfulness. Yeah, again, I would be curious to know where we go from here, basically. Yeah, if I may say, yes. Thank you. Thank you for the level of energy in your drawings.
That was very interesting, Giuliano. These very direct references, which I very much can see. I want to add something, just to something that is probably obvious to you as you were designing these spaces, but these are all, well, first of all, thank you for a really thought-provoking set of images and storyline narrative. But all these spaces, most of them rely on one thing in common, which is that they are physically demanding spaces. They are spaces where you tap into the engagement of the human body with its environment. And I do think that that's key in terms of getting people to connect at a humane level, at a very kind of interpersonal level, when your movement in space is not so codified. You have to sort of like rethink how you engage with your space. So it reveals the kind of underlying commonality of us all being human, right? So it takes away some barriers. And you see that's what people do when they go on retreats. They go play games together that demand a physical engagement. They put themselves in nature. And when you're in nature, it also, in a way, forces you or puts you in a context where you say, oh, I'm human. That person in front of me is human. There's a commonality there. There's kind of a universality there that allows you to connect at a level that perhaps, some constructs of social norms and social behavior and more codified ways of operating in the office stand in the way of that direct connection. So I think all that stuff is very interesting. And I guess my question is, can we think, and this is of course beyond the studio and all of that, but like the next step, can we think of ways in which our day-to-day architecture demands that of us, where there's enough infrastructure in the spaces that we go into that is enough there, but not that it's prescriptive in terms of how you behave, but that it demands that you question, is this a table? How do I use it? Is this a chair? How do I use it? Is there a different way that I should be using it or can be using it? And creates this kind of relationship with others in that same space. So here you've taken it where it's like a retreat. So it's an extreme, it's an exception, it's a segment in time. It's not your day-to-day work life. But what if we pulled the volume down and kind of went back into, okay, what are elements from here that can function in the day-to-day work? And I'm not talking about, the model of the Google workplace with the slides connecting rooms together. I'm just really talking about, the day-to-day objects and furniture and conditions around us in our work environment, where, that modality of exploring, I guess is what it is. It's the modality of exploring that allows you to connect to others because they see something you don't, and therefore it kind of reinforces that need to be collaborating in order to move ahead. Just some thoughts.
If I may build on that, I think for me also, it's a very impressive and ambitious project. The parts that really stood out the most to me is also how much you really amplify the senses through these activities, right? So it seems that there's an interest between all of them to almost amplify how hard can we push the limits of the body through either the playfulness of the games that you introduce, this idea of a very fit, almost gameplay, where at the same time it creates a balance to the zones where you're supposed to be working and playfully productive. But part of me also wonders, does it always need to be pushed to its limits? Or if you can think of those limits in reverse as well. So what I noticed overall is that, there's the kind of the common body being, basketball games, the slides, it seems very almost acrobatic in terms of its tectonic framework, but also how fit, right, you need to be physically part of this. And I'm asking myself, when you showed the slide with the soft and sharp objects, which I thought was really beautiful as an idea, and then those sharp and soft objects literally became inflated into these large roomscapes. I wonder if you thought of that analogy as also a parallel to how we understand rituals, meaning what are the rituals that are really hard, meaning they really push the body to limits, which I think you have an overabundance of, versus what are the rituals that perhaps are soft and allow our bodies to slow down and rest. And that'll be my one, advice, is to maybe try to see if there is a way to create that holistic balance. I can't help but think, what if you're not physically fit and you're inside the framework of your concepts? Like, how would you survive in this environment? So, for example, in Norway, you are encouraged to take a nap in a work environment in the middle of the day because it increases your productivity. So does that mean, is that definition of a slow ritual or a slow object? And what would that look like? So I think you've done, an overall really exciting project, but I almost want to see a little bit less excitement, in certain moments, just to see what is the new definition of how we encourage our body to also find that limit of productivity, whether or not it's playful productivity or capitalistic productivity, but it allows the body to also perhaps find moments of rest or even solitude. Because another part is that, every single one seems to be really focused on the idea of communal work and communal living. And I'm a huge fan of those projects. But at one point, I think it's also perhaps good to find moments where you can just reflect and just think on your own, which is not often that, something that you gain in these, highly over centralized environments.
I would like to build on that, if I may, and tie this back to Giuliano's comments earlier. So if I think back to the 60s and the kind of immediate, seeming precedents for this, I think about the Fun Palace, or I think about some of Archigram's work that one could say present more of a sort of version of an open framework within which people have agency, right? And people have the ability to actualize themselves, to exert sort of their own ideas. And, coming back to, I think, both Hannah's and Marcia's comment, and the sort of search for, or a critique of, like, the kind of requirement for able-bodied people to occupy this new leisure environment, which I completely appreciate. That it's super fun to look at, but I'm struck by, sort of its formal affinities to, say, Jimenez Lai's work and its extreme specificity in, kind of how the forms sort of intersect, the outer shape, the allocation of crochet, etc. Most of which is incredibly prescriptive, right, and requires certain abilities, right, of the body, etc. It requires the ceaseless sort of engagement, right, with the sort of activities of the environment. And I actually see this as a kind of take on what might be, sort of the dark sides, the evil sides of a lot of these tech environments today. that maintain on the surface, you know, the playfulness and the ping pong table next to the desk, and you know, this kind of image of levity and fun. Yet at the same time, they're also really like environments, you know, that pull us out of our domestic privacy, you know, that sort of negate the division between you know, the kind of private space of the home and work. And so for me, the formal specificity is something that I really appreciate in this project, because I read it as a portrayal of the pressures, right, that are being brought on by sort of the higher ups of a lot of today's, you know, seemingly benign companies.
I would like I would like to say a couple of things. Many of the projects, and I can see this in your, you know, in yours. Let's say in the 60s. This is a very general statement, because the production of architecture in those 10 years more or less was very diversified. But said that the main subject was basically social landscape. I don't know if these two words mean anything, but so in whatever way you will approach this abstract, yeah, kind of desire, yeah, to share, to be with someone else, to hope that you can, you know, share a better future. You know, all these psychologicals introduce this idea of a landscape. It's not the natural landscape that, you know, the ecologists are talking about today. It was a social one. It's a social distance. You know, how you like you're studying, you know, because an office environment is in itself a social distance. You know, how you interpret that without separating this group of people from everything else that happens around them. Yes. So I just one difference that I mean, this mentality also were introduced in the universities. I went to MIT. That's how I came to the United States, and the studio was a village. Yeah, it was a, you know, all. Yeah, students were able to sleep there, to, you know, bring their dog, yeah, to drink and maybe smoke marijuana sometimes, you know, at night. Doesn't matter. But the idea of being, the pleasure of being together, yes, you know, making a coffee, you know, things like that. And it was accepted by the faculty. Actually, you know, long discussions at 2:00 at night with the professor. So it seems to me that unless you reconquer that, yeah, starting from institutions like a School of Architecture, if I can say that, because today we all more or less, you know, separated by, you know, our individual, yeah, kind of performance, also due to the, you know, computers and all these things. I think unless you regain that also from the very beginning also, on you know, what is the experience of a student, yeah, in these 4 or 5 years he or she spends in a university. That is an important change, I think, because it does affect the way you think about your projects, yes, I know. And it's not about being right or wrong, it's a full experience, if I may say. Another thing, that there was a great deal of idealism, yes, right or wrong, whether, you know, it failed or not, you know, the Vietnam, whatever there was this idea of not only describing reality, but trying to idealize a better one, yeah, without worrying about being right or wrong. You just do it. Yes, hello. Sometimes I feel the students nowadays, and, you know, again, and I don't want to be nostalgic at all, but even at Pratt, you know, they're a little bit so you know, limited in that sense, because they try to perform intelligently and you know, somehow emotionally also as a human being, whatever that means. Yeah, they restrain, you know, their capacity, yes, to be able to be more free, yes, and more courageous, if I can, yeah. put the way. I'm not discussing about the quality of the performing, yeah, of the projects. You know, there's a lot of intelligence, yeah, of course, and that's without saying. But somehow, to, you know, kind of say, where do we go from here? Yes, in a more inclusive, emotional, political, yeah, something as an ideal contribution to the work itself. Yes, without, you know, worrying about being right or wrong, whatever that means. Yeah, if I can.
Well, I would add to that. I mean, just to pull out, I think those are really good points, and I agree with the comments that have been made. But the bigger question for me is, you know, why does anyone need to be at what we used to call work or the workplace? So it seems to me, you know, one of the things we've kind of all experienced this past year is, you know, most of us have not been in our, you know, quote unquote formal or designated workplace, prior designated workplace in person. And so I guess the question I would have, the project is a tour de force and beautifully drawn and explained, and which allows us to talk about all these things and raise these larger questions, which is perfect. And really that I'm really enjoying the comments that people are making and the comments that you made in your presentation. But I pull back and I sort of then wonder, well, why does anyone need to be here? You know, this is a particular kind of work that you're reifying. And I would just, you know, with respect to the idea of a social landscape that Juliana was talking about, or some of the precedents that Anche mentioned, you know, the notion that, especially today, that there's more agency given to the individual to define the parameters of their interaction with others is somewhat fairly at odds with what you're showing, which is a kind of, someone had to design this game, right? And that's probably the person who paid for building it. So whoever it is who runs the company, and then everyone else is a kind of player within it, which suggests a kind of tyranny that is sort of terrifying. And I guess the other aspect of it is formally what I think is works better in some places in your project than in others is just this dialectical relationship that you have between these spaces of interaction as you define them, the figures, if you will, and then the field condition being the floor plate. And because that relationship more or less is absolute and there's no blurring of that boundary, in a way, you're kind of objectifying cooperation or a particular kind of interaction, which could diminish the sort of, well, it certainly diminishes or prevents a kind of individual decision making, other than whether you decide to go into, you know, one of these elements and begin the process, but also diminishes maybe that kind of blurring of boundaries, which is where there's a sort of tension between what constitutes work, you know, what constitutes your individual experience versus collective one. I also think that, and we've experienced this with clients in different project types or programs, that there's a real concern that not everyone engages in a cooperative, interactive way. There are people who are shy. There are people who, you know, or you might just need space or time to think at different moments. And this is picking up on something that someone said earlier, but just the idea that, you know, what works for some in terms of a more active, you know, connections and direct connections, for others might not support their modes of thinking and working. But I mean, I think this is, you know, a really interesting project. I guess the only other thing, that the image that calls to mind, speaking of 1960s kind of nostalgic, is the experience of the path through this reminds me of the film The Fantastic Voyage, which was this sort of where people were shrunk down to a tiny submarine that went into someone's body and went through all the organs internally. There's this kind of quality of this as a sort of body and these organs. But again, yes, I would say the specificity of what these organs are could then be maybe more precisely defined in terms of their roles within the company or the experience of the person and the nature of the interactions they prompt.
Yes.
So I really love all the comments so far. I think I do read the project maybe slightly differently or in a different register. It seems to me, and maybe this has sort of been touched on, but it seems to me that there's the sprinkling of comments that like the reference to like, they do this, but in reality, this is happening. Or certainly the way it ends in a way that's sort of, very, very with a straight face, like, oh, they'll be more productive in the future and they'll get along better. Like that to me all says that we're in the zone of a deadpan satire that very similar to the 12 Ideal Cities or something like Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture by Kohlhaas, that this is being presented as a really great idea, and we're meant to understand that what actually this is a horrible idea that represents how bad work already is. And in the way of that, I wonder, it's a tricky, and I'm up to you whether I'm right or not, but if you're in that zone, and I'm seeing you nodding a little bit, the tricky thing is how deadpan to play it. Because there's the risk that the message gets lost, or that it's hard to be super specific when you're super deadpan. And I think even Super Studio at the conclusion say, you turn to page 50 or whatever of the 12 Ideal Cities, and they say, here's, if you liked 8 of these cities, congratulations, you're a member of the government. So like, this is what we already have. We've just put it into an exaggerated form. So I think the fact that this is in many ways dark and relentless and involves all these moments of suffering and failure, I think is quite intentional. But I think it does force questions for me of exactly what is being satirized and exactly what you're saying about it. And I think I have some of the general ideas. You're certainly problematizing meritocracy and the assumption of like who succeeds and who fails. Certainly the whole kind of culture of these like fun offices, which I think this studio has explored in many ways over the past few years. It remains a very live concept. And very specifically, the notion of like competition and collaboration, which you bring up with the prisoner's dilemma at the beginning. And what I marked as like, oh, I'm going to get them on this, and gradually came to believe was an intentional part of the deadpan satire, that you say that, what we have to do something about is the natural instinct of defection, right? That there's something innate that leads us to be competitive and to stab the other person in the back. And I was going to say, like, that's not natural at all. That's capitalism. That's ideology. And I think over the course of the project, it becomes clear that's part of the thing you would sell to the client, like to get people to go to this escape room. It's like people have this natural instinct to defect. And what you're showing is it's the boss that creates the instinct to defect. It's not natural at all. And people could learn other ways of working in the course of something that, from the boss's point of view, is supposed to make them more competitive, more productive, more kind of neoliberal atoms that produce at their desk. And you're going to create weird new relationships to work. Maybe not actually new forms of collaboration, but leading to individuals questioning, what am I doing here? And so with all that said, I think actually some of the comments that have already been made could be incorporated in by taking them head on. Specifically, the question of accessibility and how physically intense this is. It's like going on Survivor, like this like endless marathon of impossible tasks that maybe there is a room we see that, again, in a deadpan way, is like, this is where the old people and the people who aren't on 2 feet, they go and do this thing. And we sort of absorb that as another way of critiquing the fact that all of these office environments and all these bosses presume a 20 to 30 something physically fit person who goes to the gym and, is all of these things, is typically abled and all of that. Maybe the people who are the shy, they get sent to another place. Like that all gets it's part of the story potentially. And finally, very quickly, that the last thing I think that this is already satirizing, but could turn up just one more notch, like from 10 to 11, is the architects that provide this stuff. Because it seems to me this is a satire of Bjarke Ingels, or that entire lineage of post-Kohlhaasian, like, there are no problems, we just make things fun. That you're kind of satirizing your own role as creative collaborators. And of course, the title of the project has collusion in it. So you're satirizing your dilemma, I think, of people who have to collude with this system by providing fun, happy environments to extract more productivity. So I applaud you for doing all that. I applaud you for the imagery. It's all fantastic, especially for a collaboration over distance, all of that. So my comments are all kind of like around the margins. You could sharpen this, turn this up, be clear about this, and possibly consider having that that concluding moment where you take off the mask and lay out a little more of the thesis as Super Studio does. You don't have to, but I think it's worth considering. Congratulations.
If I could jump in here, and I think Professor Godel's commentary here has raised a lot of really great issues. I do believe he's pierced the heart of the project, at least from my humble point of view, and many things that he's brought up. Beautiful drawings, by the way. I don't want to go without saying that and remarking on how wonderful the documentation is. If we are to adopt this idea that satire is a big part of what we're looking at here today, I'd be interested to hear from the authors just briefly on the subject of decadence, if it came up, and what your thoughts are there. Would you mind taking that up for just a moment?
Yeah, I think our perspective of decadence is that when people see something greater, they think that that is better, and so they think that it is the place that they should be. And so our whole kind of approach to this place is that people think that just because these spaces look exciting or look or have interesting materiality, that those spaces would lead to something greater. And we were saying that, you know, sometimes it's the most mundane, banal spaces that actually get you to the promotion or get you to the head start. So we're kind of just remarking on what are the usual perceptions of decadence and how that produces something greater or better.
I would like to, yeah, these are very interesting conversations and loaded with questions. In my experience, I can recall something that, you know, there seems to be real, you know, true. The architects cannot make revolutions, they interpret social changes. So I think that's you know, in the 60s, we thought that we could make a political revolution. Yes. Yeah. I mean, in many ways. It seems to me that the world today is much more complex. You know, there's an incredible complexity. You know, so yeah, it seems to me that to interpret, you know, the complexity of the society in which we are, it's a solid way to start. You know. What I would like to say also that in your project, there's a lot of design and not so much architecture. I still make that kind of a distinction. All this, I just try to dive into this section, for example. First of all, it's totally, you're questioning the relation between form and function. There's a, you know, you use the term leisure, but that means that, yeah, you want to introduce spaces or objects, yeah, that are functional, yeah, kind of. That's what leisure is, you know, in general, you know, is about. You know, you don't have, yeah, you just let your experience, you know, be more important than instructions, you know, that is, you know, the suggested, you know, object, you know, requires. I'm just saying that. So this is a very important aspect, you know, to separate much more than we do today, yes, form and function, yeah, and introduce into our lives, in, you know, and that's a difficult task, but that is a social change. It's a change also in the profession, if I can put it that way, yeah. By the way, leisure is different from spectacle. Spectacle is visual, yeah, mainly. And there is a lot of this being produced today. Leisure, you know, involves participation. Yeah, you're part of it. Yeah, whatever that means. Another thing I would like to say is that there is initial density here. You take density and you bring it to, you know, an extreme point. It's totally interior, your project. Yeah, it's totally interior. There is no natural light. I'm just, you know, and there's a lot of packaging of design objects. They come from the production of cars, you know, some other forms of architecture, of design productions. In the 60s, we were looking at that, yes, how you stamp the metal to make a car. That maybe that process can be applied to architecture, to in a house, or to So I'm just looking at your here and there. You make sections of floors, and they look like some sort of a masonry, So it's kind of a bit of a hybrid vocabulary, if I can put it that way, because in order to support all these spaces, probably the construction is made out of metal more than concrete. I just realized, I'm kind of questioning a little bit, the actual work, and I stop there. Sorry. By the way, one of the highlights of the 60s were artificiality. In other words, there are many new, if you go to see movies and you're totally, embedded into an image, yes? Why don't we make a room where you are part of the image? I remember we used to have, we used to make a small room out of polyethylene, white, and project with a carousel projectors on the interior of this cube. And we will lie there, yes? So we were the image, kind of, yes? Totally artificial, sealed, no air conditioning, nothing, just as to feel engaged in this multiple, presentation what reality is, yes? I just wanted to say that, So artificiality, and that's what you're doing here.
I would like to jump in, if I may, agreeing actually with most of the comments, and particularly from Addison. And first, congratulating you on an incredible project. I was fascinated by how you took us, on a journey with the history of labor and different means of controlling labor, the effect of that on the internal organization of the office. So that was really fascinating. And throughout all your presentation, I was asking myself, how would an architect, or how would we, critique a working condition where no longer the boundaries between leisure and consumption versus production and labor are clear, where the two are completely mixed. And by the way, just something came to my mind, speaking of labor and leisure, so happy May Day for everyone today. That's just a side note. So I was wondering, and I kept, when you are presenting, trying to identify where the points exactly where you are critiquing this idea of play and leisure as yet another form of control. And at some moments, I thought that you are presenting this as an alternative, but then I quickly understood that this is what, as Addison said, this is more a satire, which was actually fascinating. And I think it's like an incredible strategy that you adopted. Of course, also, like taking some, clues from studio and so forth. I would just, not to speak too much, I'm still questioning, and this is an open question, and I'm just thinking loud with you. And the question that comes to mind, how do you see still that your project represents a clear critique? Like if we take this project as, like a creating performative spaces, where the idea is maybe to educate the users or to raise awareness in the user by pushing the condition to its extreme limit, showing that all these ideas of leisure of play are actually other mechanism of control. And then what also comes to mind, maybe another cautionary tale, if you may, which comes actually more from psychoanalysis, from the work of Jacques Lacan, when he also came up with the notion of surplus enjoyment. He took it from Marx in terms of surplus value, and the idea of surplus enjoyment, just to put it in a reductionist way, it's the moment when pain itself or suffering itself becomes a source of enjoyment. So it's not a clear distinction between pain and suffering on one side, and then pleasure and fun on the other. And I'm just bringing this into the discussion just to raise more a cautionary tale. What is really, how would, pushing the limits of what, or showing, bringing to the surface the already existing condition, trying to challenge all these ideas of play and leisure and fun, and showing how they are, again, other mechanisms of control. what would be the end result of a project like this for the users of this project? Would they really, go out and revolt and realize the suppression that we live in? Or would that be already appropriated and accommodated into yet another everyday life? And this becomes a source of enjoyment, which involuntarily will still feed and perpetuating the same mechanism of control. And I know this is an open question, and I maybe it's too much to ask for a project to
Yes.
an answer, but it's just something to think about. Again, I'm thinking about it myself, but that goes to show how incredible your project is by raising these questions. So thank you.
Very good. Yes.
On that note, I think we're going to wrap up and move on to the next project. Talia and Serena, thank you so much for your amazing work all year, and congratulations on a great project despite extenuating circumstances. And yeah, congratulations, guys.
Thank you so much for the wonderful comments.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you, jurors, for all of your comments. It's really great.
Okay, so next we have Adam Elstein and Lori Gibbs with Saul Anton presenting. The name of the project is, what is the name of the project? Counter Monumentality.
Cool. Shall I say one or two words to contextualize the studio before we begin? So anyway, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all in the formal informality of the Zoom room. It's really my pleasure to introduce Weena and Ari. A few words about this studio. I'm just going to paraphrase some stuff that I can put into the chat. Perhaps this, our DP section, and when I say our, it was myself, Lori Gibbs, and also Michelle Gorman, who's not here this morning, who was basically my co-conspirator for 2 years, and for half of the year this year as well. The theme of the DP section as it's been developing is architecture and magic. We began several years ago with an exploration of forms of stage magic, architecture and illusion, architecture and optics. And over time, the kind of agendas of the studio moved more and more towards looking at magic as a kind of lens through which to reframe architecture in terms of kind of social action. So this year we looked specifically at magic, not so much in terms of stage magic, but sort of ritual, natural magic, practices of power in a sense, performed by magicians in order to influence ecological and human relationships. So we had the students look at ritual, we had the students look at sort of models that kind of delineate alternative concepts of reality, the occult, the paranormal, supernatural, the alchemical, and we're interested in the students kind of blurring the relationship, the territory between thought and matter, where both magicians and architects can produce phenomenological effects, evoke psychological affects, and negotiate the boundaries between community and the other. So that's a paraphrase from our initial text. Weena and Ari have taken a specific take on this, and I will just turn it over to them right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Weena.
My name is Ari.
And our project is called Counter Monumentality, Half-Life Monumentalism for Untold Narratives. So architecture and our built environments carry a narrative through its spaces and materiality. When we start to question the built environment, we can see that cultural memory is largely determined by a dominant narrative in which major cultural moments are captured, but that may be an incomplete representation of the past. The memories that are passed down through official documentation and through the built environment often omit stories of minority and oppressed groups, and subsequently, the memorial architecture stemming from this one-sided cultural narrative, which is controlled by those who have the means to alter our built environment, don't often memorialize these stories. The question that has stayed present in our work is, how do we democratize our collective memory, and how can we redistribute authorship of our cultural narrative?
The typology of monumental architecture, as we know it, fails to address the elusiveness and individuality of memory. Its rigidity, permanence, and singular authorship are often restrictive in its bandwidth, in its narrative bandwidth. This calls for a reconsideration of the monument as we know it.
During the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, many Confederate monuments were vandalized with slogans in support of the movement. The image on the left represents collective authorship and freedom of expression as a resistance against a symbol of oppression. Man has always wanted to adorn walls with markings, stories, and ornaments since the dawn of time, and the vandalized monument offers a more complete image of the history surrounding the events that the untouched monument could not achieve. However, counter-monumentality is not inherently anti-monumentality. Instead, it embraces the spectacle of monumentality in order to invite new voices to contribute and capture the attention of those who are unaware. The counter-monument seeks to reclaim narrative tools for the communities which have fallen through the cracks of the mainstream's notice by challenging the idea of the monument in its form, materiality, scale, and authorship.
In an era of architectural erasure by gentrification, neighborhoods with complicated histories and humanitarian residences face the threat of being forgotten by their cities, becoming vulnerable to the loss of agency over their space. The neighborhood of Tarlabaşı in Istanbul, Turkey is a historic neighborhood filled with ethnic, religious, gender, and political diversity that has a complicated history of displacement and neglect over the last 80 years. As a part of small Turkish Jewish community, which historically belonged to this area of Istanbul, this neighborhood, the cycles of removal, and its tragedies have become forgotten within the larger cultural memory. As a project about narratives, we saw fit to tell a story that we are personally involved with, and bringing up those topics and starting conversation outside the community about these memories was our drive for our project.
So just to give a brief history about our site, in 1922, at the end of the Ottoman Empire, Tarlabaşı was a super prosperous non-Muslim minoritarian neighborhood. And so the main demographic of this area were Jews, Greeks, and Armenians. However, by 1942, there were wealth taxes that were applied to these minorities, targeting these non-Muslim minorities, which then drove them out of the neighborhood. There was also an event in 1950s that contributed to the larger removal of these populations called the Istanbul pogrom.
And in the around 1980s, the now abandoned neighborhood was embraced by Romani and Kurdish immigrants, mostly coming from the rural parts of Turkey. And around 1988, the street of Tarlabaşı got brought into a boulevard, disconnecting it from its surrounding further on. And now in 2016, it faces a new threat of gentrification and removal, where a new urban development has already taken a large chunk of the neighborhood and is demolished. So we are currently facing and dealing with the site as in the beginning of a new urban development and gentrification and removal.
The new development begins to encroach on the spaces of the minorities who have long lived on the site, and many of its key architectural elements are getting erased and replaced, beginning another cycle of removal. The site and its inhabitants face the threat of dissolution in the coming decades and are being actively ignored by the city, with a high police presence surrounding the neighborhood and silence politically in the nation.
Because of the neighborhood's neglect, the site was extremely difficult to document. The largely Romani and Kurdish population is extremely wary of outsiders, and when I visited in person, due to the dangerous nature of the neighborhood, we were not able to collect a large data set. Photos and videos of the neighborhood are hard to come by. The blue on the map represents the areas accessible by Google Street View, and Tarlabaşı is completely cut off from the availability of imagery. Our challenge in monumentizing Tarlabaşı was not only to be able to properly document the remains of the neighborhood, but reclaim the demolished and gentrified spaces in a non-invasive way for its native residents to navigate.
So our project manifests itself as an expanded monument, consisting of interventions at 4 different scales and different hypotheses within the public realm. The first intervention is the most nomadic, taking the form of projection mappings that pop up across various sites of ongoing urban development across the city, such as development billboards and the tarps over construction sites.
Our process of documentation began at this stage using phone footage from a moving taxi cutting across the neighborhood sourced from YouTube. We began to photogrammatically scan the spaces at whatever stage they were in. As a result, the low quality footage, the scans begin to reflect the broken and the incomplete nature of the site's architecture, capturing the essence of the neighborhood in its colors and textures. At the same time, we began to collect the graffiti and other traces of individual expression about the politics in Turkey, which discuss many of the issues of minorities of the site experience. Most of the content is about Kurdish identity, feminist issues, policing, and protests about urban development.
Both sets of documentation are the basis of digital projections, which are projected back onto the site as a memory of the architecture which is slowly disappearing. These projections can be rapidly put up and taken down at a moment's notice to avoid incrimination.
Our next intervention combines the techniques of projection mapping while taking a more material form in an episodic manner. They take advantage of sites with demolished buildings and ruins to form a physical placeholders against activities of gentrification. The language of counter-monumentalism questions the plasticity and permanence of building materials and their abilities to absorb and release narrative. Its intention is to be used as a physical platform in which invites both interaction and destruction, ensuring the evolution of its content and what it memorializes.
The facade of the intervention does not replicate what used to stand in its place. It embraces a new identity while referencing the language to what was previously there. The uncanny use of the existing typology and elements provide a language that is familiar yet distinctive to the neighborhood. The intervention is not meant to be permanent. A facade of malleable materials is held together by scaffolding, inviting decay and revealing its original void as participants begin to make and break elements of the facade. This also provides an ongoing activity while the lots wait to be reclaimed.
It was important to put our ideas of materiality to test, where we could paint, carve, and break as one would be able to on our facades. This was a meditation on what could be written on the walls, but as architects, we do not determine its contents or the way it will be used. We began to challenge the tension between permanent and non-permanent materials by treating graffiti as a building element and layering it on with non-traditional materials of wax, as well as traditional materials of brick and concrete.
Wax is a highly editable material and absorbs narrative, giving the right to communicate to even someone with fingernails or a keychain. We wanted to replicate the passing qualities of wax and how it would react to its environment and the heat surrounding it over time, releasing the narratives just by the nature of the material. This is not a meditation on form making, but a way to explore the possible decay of these interventions as environmental elements persist.
Point clouds is our way to preserve and monumentalize what was there at the time of documentation. It is not the traditional way of preserving, but achieves a flexible permanence just like the physical materials. These facades are both permanent and impermanent as they are fixed documentation of a specific time, but exist only in specific lighting conditions which allow these to be seen. These facades invite projection mapping onto the original site as a way to understand the temporality of these spaces, highlighting the spatial and textual qualities of what was on the walls previously.
Our third intervention takes our ideas of digital projection and material malleability to the street experience. It takes shape in the form of a maze on the demolished lot now owned by the luxury real estate development. The maze is an amplified manifestation of the winding spatial qualities and the density of the original neighborhood. Our processes of documentation continued further at this stage. We gathered all photos we could find from the site, sourced from social media, in-person visits, and real estate websites, and then categorized them based on physical traits to further understand the vernacular language of Tarlabaşa.
A large characteristic of Istanbul architecture is the jumba, or projecting bay window. This ranges from a small individual bay window to an entire overhanging floor. These Jumba are unique in the way they alter the experience of the street condition. We manipulated the original side grid to exaggerate the special conditions created by these Jumba typology.
These alterations create a variety of new circulation opportunities, such as dead ends, secret passageways, and false facades. These are best navigated by the local minoritarian inhabitants, but are not exclusive to only its original residents. The misaligned streets invite those who are willing and respectful of the site to explore new spaces, and the narrow branch streets of the maze prevents policing and urban development without further alienating the site and its inhabitants.
Our cataloging exercise has also revealed a palette of architectural elements such as doors, windows, and balconies, so that we may create the essence of the neighborhood in a sensitive manner. We were intrigued by the layering of styles and materials of these elements, which were often retrofitted onto the site, creating moments of uncanny textures and aesthetics.
The dead ends, false facades, and hidden paths give back moments of privacy and freedom of expression along their routes. The street circulation through our intervention allows for meandering opportunities that one could freely explore. And the altered Jumba and the bay windows create a separate layer of movement above the street level.
The Jumba and the balconies provide unique interactive opportunities with the street and its surrounding walls. Through our physical exploration, these narrow street conditions with the impermanent materiality concepts are what we aim to emulate.
Our last intervention combines all of the above strategies of digital projection, material sensibility, and circulation to create a bubbly gathering space in the shape of a forum. Gathering spaces at large in Turkey are heavily policed and monitored, with free speech being suppressed to make way for the nation's dominant political narrative. The maze acts as a protective barrier and an entry point into the assembly space, which provides the materials and the accessibility to safely voice public discourse.
Jumba, suspended by the scaffolding frame supporting the impermanent facade, provides layers of access for manipulation and vandalism. These balcony spaces and the scaffolding are meant to be climbed on, shouted upon, and cheered from, amplifying the energy of the forum and the assembly space. The spectacle of the graffiti provides a backdrop to the political discourse that is much needed in Turkey's political climate today. And the assembly space ties the public dialogue with the politics that exist on the walls.
Counter-monumentality is an attitude that seeks to treat narrative tools of the public realm, which often comes in the form of vandalism, graffiti, and property damage, as a monument itself, rather than the rigid scale and permanence that is traditionally associated with monument. Counter-monumentality begins to challenge what it means to truly monumentalize the diversity of narrative, distributing authorship and taking back the spaces and stories for those whose voices have been taken away. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Well,
so I'll open by saying I think there's some incredible work done here, and that you're to be applauded. First of all, for your the very nice reading of the supposedly vandalized monument, the idea of counter-monumentality, that these supposed vandal additions represent collective authorship, which helped reveal how limited the authorship and audience of the original monuments were. And what I really appreciate is how clearly you lay out the history and the situation here. It looks easy, but it's not, right? To get this down to very, very communicative slides, a very, very communicative text. There's no wasted verbiage. You get us the story and you give us lenses for thinking about it. And I think that's great work. Also, the documentation work that you've begun to do is something that whatever happens from this, like even just gathering that material could be of value to people here. So I think that's great. I have a few kind of questions or concerns. I don't think any of these are like, this makes it a bad project, but I think they're things you would want to keep thinking about if you pursue these ideas further. Number one is, with the focus on things like graffiti, I think it's a little easy to say that these represent the voices of the community broadly. They certainly represent some people's voices, but like thinking about just demographics, like who is the person that takes the spray paint and does this? Is that literally everybody in the community, or are we privileging certain voices? Are we privileging the people who feel, young, free, and aggressive, whoever that is? Number two, the kind of idea of the space that's easy to do a protest or that's resistant to policing is certainly something that projects continue to try and explore. I think it's very, kind of easier said than done. I think, you can look at the space and on the one hand see the devices that are there to make it less policeable, but also the devices that would make it very policeable, right? This feels like a easily kettled zone, right? You just close off the exits. It's kind of a police dream in a certain way, but a protest dream in others. And finally, I would say, when you get to your own interventions, the projections, the waxwork, all very interesting to me. But at that point, you are the authors, right? You're not necessarily setting up a system or a set of tools for other people to collectively author something. You are producing an authored monument of a kind, closer to the stuff on your original slide that surveys all the different, architectural or artists' interventions. So I would just keep thinking about that and questioning, how can we further destabilize our own role as the authors of this story? And maybe it even means, at a everyday level, like collaborating with other existing groups or doing more conventional oral history work that might let you reach other voices, and so on and so forth. That's just a starting point. But again, amazing work and great to see it. Thank you.
I want to add to some of that. I thought that was a really great comments. I guess this calls to mind kind of the relationship between sort of infrastructure and form, and that in a way, what the more, to me, provocative and suggestive parts of the project are when you're creating a kind of infrastructure for memory, or that doesn't necessarily resolve itself to the same kind of objectification that you're critiquing through your project. So, and then in that sense, it can become a kind of prototype, which could be something that is deployed outside of the specific neighborhood. In other words, rather than kind of making the entire neighborhood into a larger form, if you will, of a monument through these interventions, which is very beautiful. And certainly there's reasons to recognize the qualities of this neighborhood over time. But thinking about it as an infrastructure, I almost think about it, also calls to mind almost thinking about it as a kind of landscape proposition where, this is a temporal set of relationships that you set up, and then you allow them to occur in the same way that, a landscape in terms of its sort of character as a kind of something that is seeded, if you will, and then begins to take on a life of its own. I mean, I think those are all there, and you're engaging those in different ways. But I guess those are the parts that I feel like are the most successful and a really beautiful project. And I just echo what Addison said about the work that you put into understanding the neighborhood and the history and sort of the siting of these places and the way in which you teased out these kind of opportunities. It's really, really well done.
I would like to jump in also, echoing many of these comments, and congratulations again, another fascinating project. And we did have a brief discussion in the past about this project. So I'm happy to see the development and to see, the sophistication that you guys achieved, like really admirable. I would say, again, you are dealing with very complex and contradictory issues and very pressing issues. And it's really ambitious and fascinating that you are trying to deal with multiple issues, not just one single one. You're not just trying to single one of them. For example, the way I understood it, you want to resist the real estate pressure that's invading the neighborhood. You want to preserve the neighborhood through the documentation. But also, and I can see that you want also to open the neighborhood to the outside. We want to integrate it to the larger city. And that's why, one of your beautiful maps, I see that you have multiple points of intervention in the existing fabric of the city that's beyond just the boundaries of your neighborhood. And I think this is fascinating. Again, deploying several strategy of multimedia, monumentality, counter monumentality, graffiti, and the interaction with the user. And just echoing some of the points that Addison raised, I was a bit slightly lost when you focus on this kind of, I would say, like medieval-like pattern of the street, the winding street, the narrow streets, as mechanism of trying to resist police control. And I would echo Addison comments here that that's not necessarily the case, and I have clear examples coming from Egypt. One has to do with the slum areas around Cairo, where the pattern is completely narrow street, winding, very very kind of disorganized pattern. And yes, it's difficult for the police to penetrate, but actually it's very easy to control the whole area by controlling the exit and the entry point, and then you can suffocate the whole neighborhood. A counter example to that also actually is Tahrir Square, which is actually is part of modern Cairo, not the medieval pattern, which with all its Haussmannian like of Bolivar and the nodal points, and not to essentialize a particular typology, but just to show that at least historically what took place, because of the urban condition of Tahrir Square, actually that allowed for large, huge gathering from multiple parts of Cairo to gather in that spot. So just to problematize a little bit the easy correlation between winding narrow street as immediately means resistance to control. So I would definitely raise that. I would still like, that's maybe the last one again, and these are all it's not really critique, it's more just questions. If you can still emphasize a little bit and show more how you envision integrating the neighborhood with the larger city. Because one always runs the danger of trying to preserve a particular neighborhood at the expense of even making it more excluded from the larger. Given the condition we all live in now, the global condition, we know that that's not even possible. So I would like to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, my comment is very simple. I think the project is beautifully presented. I mean, you really, this has been said by my colleagues, and it also resembles some projects, and actually, from the 60s. Again, excuse me if I sound a little bit, no nostalgia, but I cannot not recall the fact that to bring the image of the television, and just going back in time into the streets, into the public landscape, which we discussed with the controversial consequences, was actually, performed by many, in schools, in university. The difference I can see here for a moment, you're more describing a technique because you have the computer and it's wonderful to visualize all these moments or these projections. I would say in the 60s, they will actually go in the street, risking to be stopped by the police. And they will actually project, yes, at a certain time, usually at night, yes, in images that sometimes were disturbing. They were not, there was and it created this idea that a city is a collection of events, not a buildings. Yeah, it's a theme that has been carried through the 70s and the 80s. I remember Bernard Tchoumi also as an example. They were linked to this, even some work, early work of Zaha Hadid, to create, to kind of, they were not discussing projections, of course, digital or done, but even the buildings, they appear to be like almost like events, yes? And I just wanted to say there's a big difference if you actually, do this in real, in a real space, yes? It would be difficult to go to Turkey and do it. I understand that altogether, but I just want to draw a difference, let's say, between what you're doing safely in a way, yeah, to what actually would be something that used to be called the urban guerrilla, yes, yeah, because yeah, you stop the public, yeah, I mean, you intervene with the public space of the street, yeah, right, okay, so it is something that might not be desirable on the part of the institutions, whatever that means, you know, it's really a change of reading, yeah, of what is. And the other thing I would like to know if this is, if I want to understand, this area is kind of is it a form of restoration of an historical part of the city? And how do you, you know, can you explain that, if I can put it that way? Yes. Yeah, okay. Another thing I would like to say is that whatever you do, you know, with a projector, you undermine the architecture of the building. There's no question about it. Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a intent there. Yeah, and it's not being explained, kind of, because in architecture, and if you think about even a ruin has its own, you know, relevance. Yes. Yeah, even a building that is, you know, I would say an important building or a neighborhood that is, you know, in decay, yeah, in a way, it recalls some respect as well, you know, whatever that means. I don't quite. So you're altering the reading of the architecture of the building, yeah, and it's not clear whether you know, a kind of a expressionistic painting or collage, yeah, right. What does it do, yeah, to the understanding of the building, or the way, or the history of it, yes, or the street. I'm just, you know, it's a bit more about having the technical possibilities to do all this, yeah, with the, you know, with the video screens, yes, okay, with the digital screens. But then it's kind of not clear what is the purpose of this, in my opinion. Yeah, you mentioned the neighborhood, you mentioned the architecture of the buildings, but yeah, it's not clear what the objectives are, in my opinion.
Yeah, I have a slightly different reading on it. Oh, go ahead, Hannah. Oh, okay. So I find the project actually to be incredibly sensitive and precise, and in taking on many layers of how prejudice, and specifically political prejudice, can affect acts of healing, I would say, through the lens of architecture. So for me, actually, you take on so many layers that maybe the most specific ones sometimes get literally blurred out of the message. I'm also slightly sensitive to this type of work because I happen to be from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I lived there during the genocide in the early 90s, and I'm very familiar with what happens 30 years later when urban preservation comes in and they decide to rebuild everything as it was constructed previously without actually trying to highlight or fix the root of the issue that was there to begin with. So I think for me, how I understood the layers of your project is that you're actually finding a universal prototype that can be applied to almost any site that has gone through a type of prejudice that has affected literally architecture. And you're doing it through this idea of a grafted facade. So that facade becomes a tectonic framework that's somehow amplified through materiality. That facade also becomes a type of message, literally, the way, you know, similarly Egyptians used to use hieroglyphs in the messages of ancient facades to tell a story. In this case, I could argue that it's a type of almost a library or a message that tells us what the story is of the site that could be defined further. And I think the third part is also whether or not the actual act of architecture can become a type of political instrument, which is the part that I think many of the critics are literally focused on at the moment. For me, the most exciting moments, and I mean this in terms of just finding a way to heal these sites or convey what had happened without burying it through urban preservation, and at the same time allowing them to survive and to be livable. If you look at, for example, the work of Labius Woods, who used to always critique urban preservation but also critique this desire to sometimes also completely abandon what happened and build something completely unexpected and new. I think you're trying to find that third principle where you're building something novel out of the residue, literally, of what had occurred, which is really hard. So I think the questions for me are whether or not it is actually necessary for it programmatically to have the platform for a protest. And the only reason why I'm saying that is because I think the architectonics of the facade as this skeleton that has the ability to absorb different materialities that literally melt and blur tectonically through process of volume are actually a type of message and a type of protest in itself.
Yes.
So for me, you know, when I saw the kit of parts, the kit of elements of existing windows, doors, apertures, that level of detail can become something that further conveys the message of how you use ductility through perhaps methods of being able to continue to convey your message and perhaps continue to redesign as the authors, aka architects of your projects, what the next steps are, or the tools or the kit of parts that could essentially be positioned to almost any site across the world that has gone through this what is the what if, the next step as architects, and can begin to literally amplify sound, amplify materiality, amplify understanding of what had occurred, but also provide a platform for, I would say, peaceful dialogue where everyone can be heard and you can experience it through the lens of architecture, literally, which is the hardest act. So for me, you know, also on a even larger hypothesis, the fact that it takes on the so-called monument and the sculptural quality of it, I really applaud, because I think you're saying, look, you can actually live within this message, within this tectonic facade, and it continues to find a new method of living while it can be grafted onto these sites that have experienced prejudice. But I think the material aspects and kind of the tactility or how the senses are activated, and through this perhaps the umbrella of healing could be explored even further. But I think you've actually done a really phenomenal job, and I think the reason why you're getting kind of the mix of the critiques is because it is such a hard site to take on, right, through the lens of architecture. And I think you're proving that architecture can be a political and is a political act. And it's a really hard one to do, where I think your intention of your project isn't to amplify or glamorize violence, but to actually find a way, and I just keep using the word heal because it's the only one I can think of right now in the context of what you described, but to set up a tectonic framework, you know, so from building materials to structures to the fact that this thing is animate. The drawings that you had, the axonometric ones, I wish you would go to them, that showed the steel, the skeleton, like how it actually works, were so powerful as a kit of tools and you know, spatial and structural algorithms. I see it's something that can go, you know, can kind of capture any facade, and you can, you know, move forward and keep building.
I'd like to build on that. Oh, sorry, Hannah, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have so many conflicts in my mind right now, also personally, because I'm originally from Beirut, and a lot of the images that you showed reminded me of, you know, some of the recent transformations of Martyr Square in Beirut, where artists and citizens and, you know, have occupied that whole space and transformed it into really their canvas, making art pieces there in situ, taking over buildings and expressing themselves, and ongoing, you know, for months and months and months until they're all blew apart. But but I think the one thing that the big question in my mind is this, you know, architects are commissioned by people of power and by authorities, generally speaking. And those figures that you're showing as the actors there in that image that we're looking at, their message is specifically that they're not waiting for you to give them a canvas to draw on. They're going to take it. That's part of it. That's part of the action, is that you take something that is not given to you and you express yourself on it. There's an imposition of the layering and the history and the messaging that happens there. And I feel that, so because our position as architects, generally speaking, is on the other side of that table, generally speaking, and those monuments that are defaced, or these buildings that are reconfigured or defaced, however way we want to talk about it, are not orchestrated by us. That kind of action is not orchestrated by us. And that's its nature, that's its definition, is that it's guerrilla action. And so, yet there is the possibility that architecture can be working hand in hand with the underserved, with the oppressed, and those that have decided that they need to take this kind of action, right, to make their voices heard and to make change happen. So what is that architecture? Like, what is that architecture that is infrastructure that promotes this kind of change? And I'm not sure, as beautiful as I agree with everybody that the project is very beautiful and tries to be very sensitive about how it operates. My concern is that it somehow sanitizes in a way, or fixes something which by nature wants to defy this kind of preservation. So those are my thoughts about it, but I do agree that it's powerful and it's very thought-provoking, I guess, in terms of the nature of what we can and can't do as architects and where we might want to see the field going.
I agree on what you said, fully. It seems to me it has at the very end of all, it has to do with the content of these images also, because they can be very provocative, or it could be an embellishment, if you want, of a street that is in decay, There's a sort of an event in the summer, and people can be invited, they can talk to each other, they have a coffee, whatever it is. So it depends what we are discussing. The technology is there. Can I very briefly say something? I had a group of radical architecture. We used to project at night on the baptistery in Florence. So the white marble, the baptistery, for us was a screen. Well, they put me in jail, me and two other, friends of mine, because you interrupt the public, because it destroyed the image of the historical, touristical, kind of presence of this monument. Another project was to project over the facade of Santo Spirito, which is a Brunelleschi church, at night, projecting on this unfinished facade, images from the Vietnam War, you name it, to kind of disturb the public sort of reading of the city as a sort of beautiful, touristical, So it depends very much on the image also, Emmanuel, at the very end, and then it's kind of questionable. I don't know, I don't have an answer to that today.
I want to, oh, sorry, go ahead. I want to come back to Marcia's and Hannah's comments, and perhaps Addison's mention of sort of authorship in this, because it seems to me that one of the kind of bigger implications of the project is that sort of redefinition of how we as architects can and cannot insert ourselves in the middle of what is at times an ongoing conflict, in the middle of what often is really a multiplicity of voices. And I'm struck by some of the sort of catalog of strategies presented here, beautifully presented. And the sort of notions of authorship and or sort of economic provision, if you will, that is implied here, right? Even with something like projection mapping, like where is that projector, who purchases that, where is it located, and how does that sort of implicate, you know, certain private spaces in the vicinity, which is very different, right, from say the graffiti that comes onto a surface kind of at night and to some degree remains anonymous.
Yes.
And so I would very much sort of ask the students to add this to your project, right? That it has to sort of be clear who is doing what, right? And how this maps out in time, you know, specifically because I find it so potent and timely and important that you are thinking of this monumentality as something that is evolving in time and therefore can respond to changing conditions, multiple histories, multiplicities, right, of voices. But in all of that, it is so important, right, how we as architects are able to, you know, at times perhaps, you know, subversively provide creative parts, whereas in other times really become part of the activists, whereas at other times do the research and sort of propagate the memory in other ways. And you're doing all of those things, but you are not sort of thematizing this in the way you're talking about it.
Yeah, maybe I can just share my thoughts as well. I really appreciate how you know, the project's kind of dealing with kind of the multiplicity of expression, both of how my sort of how I express myself as individual bodies, or how kind of on an architectural level that the entire facade or even the district is able to kind of facilitate that. I guess I'm also, curious about how that kind of platform you guys created to have that, to allow that kind of expression would actually facilitate actual conversations, which is something that I guess I'm kind of curious about, is that there, because I guess one thing that was also kind of not, to me, that's a little unsure, I guess uncertain for me, is also that, you know, if it's how like these kind of platforms are mobilized in a way, or even enacted. I guess maybe kind of the ways to think about how kind of these platforms you are creating for individual expression is actually able to channel into a method or to means to facilitate conversation, maybe is a way to kind of address the questions of how of mobilization. But it's really beautiful and it's really thought-provoking. Congratulations.
This conversation could go on and on. It's very intriguing. Yeah, it's very intriguing. So in a way, the project is wonderful because it does suggest all these questions. Yeah, these yes. So it is calling for attention. That's the primary, I think. Responsibility of the students becomes a subject of discussion among a larger group of individuals, in this case, all of us. So it has this impact. Yeah, yes. I think it's very wonderful. Another thing I would like to say, excuse me, is that historically speaking, a little bit, you know, yeah, I would like to recall the fact that there's so many images that have entered now into the interiors of our apartments. And I wonder whether you need to bring more images in the streets. Excuse me if I simply make this observation, a potential is there. We have all the technology, even more so than when I was a student. But yeah, is it necessary? I mean, in a way, is this, I mean, to raise the question is fantastic. You know, what follows I don't know. It seems to me we are under different circumstances nowadays. We are flooded with images when we walk, when we have a lunch, when we have a breakfast in a coffee shop. The television runs 24 hours a day. Yes, you can go to movies. You can download it. Maybe it would be nice to go into this neighborhood and touch the buildings with your hands, smell them. I don't know, do something else. I'm just trying to say that, a bit.
I will add one thing that was perhaps shouldn't have been shocking for me, but was it when I was in Martyr Square, maybe like 2 years ago, with all the graffiti on the buildings, the art set up, the kind of political upheaval that it was. You saw people everywhere posing for their Instagram photo. That was the thing to do. It had become like an aesthetic kind of backdrop that was devoid of the message behind it. And clearly those people, they were dressed to the nines, right? Perfect makeup, heels, the whole thing. They were not there to do the protest or to speak their voice. They were just there to be in the scene. So I worry a little bit about this kind of environment that could fall into being curated, a curated environment. And I think that that is not your intention. So I think you have to just think about fluidity of and transformability of different parts of the city, perhaps, so that it's not really about, this is the place that I go because this is where I'm allowed to express myself, or this is where I'm allowed to join forces with other citizens that agree on this or disagree on that. But maybe think about the city in a more nimble way that allows for a decentralized, back to I think what was said by earlier in the conversation, that, this is perfect for controlling the crowd because it's one space and it's closed. So what if it were actually more something that was fluid in movement, decentralized, somehow could happen everywhere? It is the anti-monument in that case, right?
Well,
because
no, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just because it's not fixed, you cannot capture it, and you cannot say that put it in a box. You cannot put it in a box, so it becomes the anti-monument.
Yeah. For me is sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Is just that this project has looked at the problem sorry, I'm back. This project has looked at the problem from the outside in, although there are implications for personal space on the public realm with respect to, say, the balconies, as he's projecting elements from residential, spaces above the street. But I wonder if playing with the tension of this membrane between the public and the private realm more fully and from both sides, in a way, if you will, from the inside and the outside, could maybe partially address what Anna's mentioning or described, and then the other thing that I'm called to mind is the sort of notion of shrines, that exist inside of homes, even in certain religious cultures, and just what that means, relative to the memories and so the kind of scale and the way in which you can control that within your own place. So I mean, there's so many ways to go with this. This is not really a criticism. It's just kind of bringing to mind, other possibilities and opportunities to further kind of elaborate on the really, really interesting ideas that you brought forth for the project. So yeah, really enjoyed hearing your presentation and the comments that people have been making. It's really been interesting.
Wasn't going to say anything, but I feel like the conversation has been so rich, Wina and Aria. I really want to jump in and add my 2 cents. Actually, this actually picks up on the last comment. First of all, congratulations on a really rich project. I think you should, measure the accomplishment on the basis of obviously the conversation and all the potential the conversation is unfolding, because I think you're realizing, the sign of a good project, I said this on Friday, is how much work it puts in front of you rather than all the work that you've done. So for that, my thought here is picking up on that last note on the question of the distinction between public and private. If I take your premise, which is that public space is constituted by memory, first and foremost. And maybe that is a kind of super program. All programs, and I'm thinking here in a way, kind of all programs are always folded within a kind of prior program that is a program always of memory, in which the city and the social body remembers itself. And it does so on 2 or multiple levels. One is a public level, obviously, and another is private level, the level of, private interests, whether those interests are, circulatory, related to work, related to leisure, and so on and so forth. But the kind of, the structure that enfolds all of them is the structure of memory. And I think I just wanted to sort of try to describe that, because I feel like that's kind of what you've understood a little bit. And if that's true, and one could discuss that, right? But nevertheless, let's just say that's true as your working hypothesis. Then the question becomes, when you show that drawing, scaling out your project across the city, the implication of that is that your work about this neighborhood is applicable to the entire urban condition of Istanbul and cannot be restricted to the neighborhood, right? Because why? Because the question of the memory of this neighborhood is a question for the whole of Istanbul and obviously the whole of Turkey as a whole, right? And that raises to me a really kind of interesting and weird problem, because what you've done is you've exploded the monument, right? The monument is everywhere and nowhere. Once it's a facade, a tectonic kind of element that can be generalized, everything is a monument. And that's what I think is so, I don't want to use the word radical, but ambitious about the project. And so if that's the case, then I think one of the questions that you're asking us to think through is, what, if any, are the limits of memory? Where does memory sort of find its limit? Because ultimately, and I think architects will say this, right? To the extent that you're designing usable space with program, there is to some extent a priority for the actual moment of use where something is not simply remembered, but actually forgotten. Why? Because it must instantiate the present. And so there's, to me, a kind of not a contradiction in a negative sense, but a productive question for you about the relationship between past and present. And I'm not saying this as a provocation. I'm saying this as a provocation for you to think a little bit about, because I think the unlimitation of memory is both exciting and interesting and fascinating, but it also needs to have an internal limit somewhere. And I think Adam's question, at least that's how I understood the question you were kind of asking, for what it's worth. But congratulations, because that's a really fascinating problem, not just in architecture today, but in the humanities as a whole.
I hate to take the punch bowl away when the party's getting interesting, but unfortunately, we've been going for an hour. I just wanted to thank everybody. I think, Laura, you had some final comments, and also the students had some final comments.
Yeah, I just really wanted to congratulate you on raising such rich, thoughtful discussion and the questions your project was able to investigate. One last little thing about what Saul was saying, I think how you explored materiality and questioned materiality relative to the role of, architecture itself, questions of preservation, change over time, how it, and how documentation also plays a role in all of this, I think was, I admire that you really tried to explore all of these aspects of the issue. Yeah, it was such a pleasure, and thank you so much to all the critics. I think it's just so beneficial to have this kind of discussion. So
thank you guys all so much for the great diversity of comments. We really, really appreciate everything that was said today. Thank you so much.
Bye, 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 bye.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We're coming into our third and final project of this morning's session, which is from my studio with Evan Tribus and Alex Deleuze, called Future Public's Speculative Grounds. And I'm going to say a few words to introduce the studio, and Evan, just chime in. I actually extracted from our brief for this exercise.
Good job. We're also organized.
So our section, which I think this is our third year doing Future Publics, right? Which it's been morphing over time, is arguing for near future hybrids of architectural, urban, natural, and political ecologies. And at the macro level, the Future Public seminar and studio investigates disciplinary hybrids between architecture and landscape and other types of hybridity. In effect, we're really trying to create a means of conveyance for radical new approaches to public space in the 21st century. So even as we observe disciplinary thinking trying to distill nature from culture and vice versa, we believe that the most important works of our time are inventions and scenarios that rise above these kind of categories. And public space is our ground. And we think about ground in multiple different forms, but it's frequently, as we observe, an ambiguous territory of negotiation, interaction, exchange, performance, and collectivity. It's social, ecological, political, and cultural. So beyond the design of public space, we extend the idea of publics to include concepts such as the commons, which implicate shared resources such as the digital commons, which the project you're about to see will engage, the environment, the air we breathe, and the water we drink, as well as our shared social contracts.
I have nothing to add. That was perfect. Do we both write that? I think we both wrote that.
We did. I had to edit out the verb blur. We're trying to edit that out for discourse on hybridity, and it's tricky.
Yes. We have the word list that we excise. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anyway, enough about us.
Yes. So without further ado, we would like to introduce to you Ali and Isa. And why don't you take us away?
Much, Catherine. Thank you. So I'm Isa. And I'm Ali. And our project is Electric Dream Tigers, Scenes from the Collective Unconscious. How can dreams create a sense of agency in public space? We believe that under certain conditions, especially a pandemic, dreaming becomes a vital way to experience collectiveness. Our degree project does not seek to alter the physical environment. Rather, we propose a user interface that uses mixed reality as a tool to project dreams into public spaces. Through this process, citizens have the chance of revisiting and sharing dreams as a coping mechanism in order to reclaim the publics that have been lost. This project is an experiment. It draws on the experience of magical realism in the 60s through which Latin Americans who read and wrote the literature of this movement created their own sense of publics, as theirs was being stripped away due to violence. Electric Dream Tigers is a response to a transgenerational anxiety that has been heightened with the loss of shared experiences in publics, which we face today.
Dear user, before you proceed into Electric Dream Tigers, we'd like to offer information on how we started. The term Dream Tigers originated from one of the most prominent writers of magical realism, Jorge Luis Borges. In his short story, Dream Tigers from 1960, Borges recalls his childhood fascination with the tiger and his inability to recall that image in his dreams. No matter how hard he tries to recall his picture-perfect, striped Asiatic royal tiger, he simply cannot, for never can my dreams engender the wild beast I longed for. The tiger indeed appears, but stuffed or flimsy, or with impure variations of shape or of implausible size, or all too fleeting, or with the touch of the dog or the bird. Borges alludes to the magic behind dreams of distorting, mixing, and reconfiguring reality. A dream image, like a tiger, may appear exclusively personal, but the literature of magical realism also explored the possibility that dream processes like these were of public interest, the work of a collective unconscious.
The citizen dream player is what we call the user of Electric Dream Tigers. Our project is modeled after the creators of magical realism, the initial dreamers, who in the violent tumultuous years of the 1960s in Latin America resorted to this new literary genre, which juxtaposed elements of reality with fantasy and fiction to cope with their lack of public space. In magical realism, magic, fantasy, and fiction have the power of invading highly detailed and realistic settings, a method of critiquing real occurrences through the use of the subconscious and the imaginary. We have looked primarily at the work of Borges, Marquez, and Cortázar, whose works were fundamental in defining the movement. In their writing, these authors explored themes such as dreams, fantasy, parallel worlds, memory, symbols, randomness, and contradictions. Magical realism acts as the redemption of fiction in the face of reality that is still becoming progressively more disorderly. Our very own parents and grandparents through this disorder, having to endure citywide curfews, violence, and chaos in their very own cities. Magical realism was a response to the loss of public space at the time. Shared feelings made their way onto the pages of a book. However, our team, composed of architects instead of writers, wondered how we could create visual stories instead.
Electric Dream Tigers is a new visual technology. Thus, our team looked at a multitude of historical precedents for visual entertainment devices, particularly those of the 19th century. We were immediately drawn to the Mayorama the most, as it expanded for our love of visual narrations. The Mayorama, much like a card game, holds the potential to be endlessly shuffled and rearranged. Each card contains a scene, and each combination of cards creates a different storyline. We use this narrative process as a process to visualize dream and explore the combinatorial nature of them, as the average person has 3 to 7 different dreams a night. We've both kept dream logs since the fall semester, and aside from writing our dreams out, we also made it a habit to draw them out. Through this process, we uncovered that different people with different dreams still all managed to share similar elements and experiences. This allows for the possibility of dreams to be stitched together.
Borges' story inspired us to create our own method of architectural dream tigering. Dream tigering, both in Borges' context and ours, is an investigation into how dreams transform the visual language from waking life, where architectural elements, symbols, and language become misconstructed and remixed. Using our own personal dreams, along with dream logs from friends and strangers, we were able to visually recreate dreams through rethinking architectural assemblages. With the added twist of dream tigering, which recreates the phantasmagorical essence of dreams, we catalog the absurdities that usually go unrecognized in your dream state. A window as a roof or form of enclosure, a door as a ramp or form of vertical circulation, or a portico as a seating arrangement. These dream tigered elements, which unexpectedly take on the function of other architectural elements, challenge the collective language and experience of architecture that people have in waking life, much like Borges' tiger did. In order to bring this process to life, we choose mixed reality rather than AR or VR due to its interactive nature. Mixed reality becomes a tool to achieve magical realism today, in which the virtual, as fictional, has the ability of inhabiting the physical. As mentioned by the data visualization expert Nihant Cherukuru in his essay Atmospheric Data Visualization in Mixed Reality, the ability of mixed reality to hyperlink reality into the supernatural environment lies in its ability to allow physical objects and spaces to coexist with virtuality, just like real settings coexisted with fictional experiences in novels of magical realism.
Now that we've gone over our mission statement and our origins, let's get started. Participation and subscription is free to the public. You just have to click yes to that pesky terms and conditions box that no one ever really reads. Next, make an appointment with us to get you fitted for all the tech gear you need. It's quite simple, really. All you need is our patent pending device that records your dreams while you sleep. Think of it like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch that keeps track of your sleeping patterns just with an upgrade, and a mixed reality device of your choosing. That's about it. While you sleep, our analysts gather and organize your encrypted data and send it over to the architects who work hard in the Dream Lab, a virtual environment where parts get designed and tested. After that, our team of programmers exports the architect's Dream Tigered elements into the MR visualization software, and you're all set to explore. So to recap, you create an account, start downloading all your dreams to a cloud database, and using your MR viewing tech of choice, you have full access to the whole growing conglomerate of dreamt recollections, nightmares, fantasies, and memories of all the architecture in the world.
Congrats! You signed up for our interface. Let us walk you through our team process. In this example, user one's data shows that the column is one of their most recurrent architectural dream elements. The other night, user one had a dream, and the most important symbol recorded was a bubble bath with a rubber duck floating in the middle. The architect takes these inputs and creates a hybrid dream tigered element using both the column and the bathtub dream that is not far off from something the user dreamt about. This way, the digital dream catcher sweeps both architectural and non-architectural thoughts. Dream tigered elements, in this case the column pipe, is rendered accordingly to the attributes of the original dream. The possibility that a dream tigered element morphs into something completely different, even opposite in feeling from the original dream, sometimes occurs and showcases the power of the collective unconscious. Having both nightmares about drowning in global warming inducing black oil or dreams about your childhood rubber ducky, don't fret, the output will be rendered accordingly.
While our service can be deployed anywhere where there is a willing public, we've chosen Fort Tryon Park in Washington Heights as our beta testing site. Due to political turmoil and violence in Latin America, Washington Heights had its biggest influx of Latinos during the 1960s. Those who fled brought difficult memories with them. 60 years later, a pandemic struck and inflicted even greater pain into the wound that is the loss of public space. The pandemic robbed all of us of physical collective experiences that were once such an integral part of life. However, it struck even closer to home for the Latin American community, where the pandemic reawakened the difficult memories and loss of public space the previous generation had faced in the 60s.
Through photogrammetry and site surveying, our architects have mapped out the following sites as blank canvases for the Dream Tiger elements to be overlaid. Through our service, architects become designers in the Dream Lab, while citizen Dream players become primary world builders as they move through the physical world, providing the story. Architects provide the object, while citizen Dream players become the engine. It is early in the morning as the set is beginning to be populated by Dream Tigered elements. The overarching theme of today's collective construction revolves around challenging the idea of structure. User one's dream last night gives gelatinous attributes to the Dream Tigered base structural element. User 2 dreams of a greenhouse made out of grass accounts for the rest. While scenes are usually made out of Dream Tigered elements that are deployed and reset time after time again, sometimes our architects and programmers like to have a little fun and drop some Easter eggs, such as the use of oil in this particular scenario. Different users occupy the site, influencing the behavior of the scenes all at the same time, allowing for different experiences of the scenario and new explorations of the site one might not have previously had. Propaganda and advertising cover the operating expenses of our venture. Want to get rid of the propaganda from Starbucks that has appeared due to your recurrent dreams of relating to a hot cup of coffee? Coming soon, Electric Dream Tiger's premium subscription. As a new CDP enters the site, everyone can experience things starting to change as a new dream is added into the mix. This interface lets us explore our dreams with the dreams of other Citizen Dream players. This way, we have acquired the ability of exploring the public through the act of collective dreaming. In this exploration, much like a game of chess, no two games can ever be the same. Here you can see how different dreams from different users can create a sense of multiple temporal consciousness, a collective construction of publics. Rather than sleepwalk through your waking state, what if you could wake walk through your dreams?
By taking inspiration from the book Cinemaps by Andrew deGraff, we learn that axonometric mapmaking brings everything to life. deGraff brought films to life by showcasing each film's cinematic spaces and/or universe. We wanted to do the same, but with Dreamspace, an opportunity to zoom out and show the Dream Labs in action. In his essay on the pre-war German film industry, Calico World, film theorist Siegfried Kracher tells us how the film set has the ability to create extensive worlds and narrations within restrictive and relatively small spaces. These set fragments become the backbone of the story, creating a perception of space that never existed in the first place. The axonometric allows us to step back and take a look at the larger implications of this new collective unconscious future public, how individual narratives can start becoming shaped by this new collectiveness. The dream starts to function as landmarks and visual signifiers. This image tells the story of two dreamers who agreed to meet their coffee date under the portico billboard lake to discuss their shared experience of dreams, which involve swimming and eating.
Storytelling, whether it be through literature, film, or electric dream tigering, is a means of visualizing and retelling parts of the human experience, a way to confront and cope with reality. Electric Dream Tigers has the aim of empowering people to reclaim public space by being able to visualize and walk through memories and feelings through an act of collective dreaming. It allows for new possibilities of awareness of the subconscious. We believe that under certain conditions, especially a pandemic, dreaming becomes a vital way to experience collectiveness. As expressed by architectural historian Beatriz Colomina in her article Privacy and Publicity in the Age of Social Media, technological prosthetic devices have become a main source of collectives and interaction. This article came out a few years ago, and since the pandemic, its main argument has become exponentially more true. As our response to this situation, we recognize that mixed reality can become the tool to achieve magical realism today, in which the virtual, as fictional, has the ability of inhabiting physical space. This way, both physical and virtual space act as a juxtaposition of the real and the fictional, and together serve to critique or question reality. Borges, dreaming, architects, programmers, and mixed reality combine together to create our future public.
Thank you.
Thank you to our electric dream tigers.
Where do we go from here?
Can you just explain? Sorry, one thing. My Zoom was cutting out a little bit, but could you just explain a little bit about how I understand in the mapping, the axonometric, this makes this information visible, but I lost the thread of how people share these specific environments that they create or how they're combined into the collective. Is there a mechanism that brings this imagery into other people's dreams or overlays them on the spaces? I may have missed that, so sorry if I did.
Yeah, no problem. So we were thinking that mixed reality through the use of like the headset goggles, which is the most known device would be how you get to experience seeing everyone's dreams at once. And the programmers would be responsible for kind of deploying everyone's dreams.
I see. I see. Thank you.
Sorry, the subject is immense because, you know, what is a dream? What is a dream? I don't want to, but what I find a bit simplistic is to think that, you know, when you have a dream, you think about architectural elements. Yeah, you seem to, I mean, just maybe you're forced to visualize, you know, this entire concern, and therefore you have to find a way to graphically find a solution. Yeah, and that is incredible because yeah, you're doing this to communicate, you know, abstract thoughts basically. Yeah, and you visualize them. What bothers me a little bit is that the dimension of a dream, and you mentioned Borges, my God, it's unlimited. You know, I mean, it does not have to relate to products, you know, situation like the column, you know, the drainage of it from a sink, you know, and the so-called rubber duck. It seems to me that it becomes a vocabulary there that is very personal, maybe yours, I don't know. But it's also a little bit childish, I think, to some degree, because, yeah, because we all, you know, we are architects, we are studying architecture, we are practicing it. Yeah, why do I have to go to this kind of preconceived images also about what architecture is? Once you can, you know, yeah, and also how do they come from this immense dimension that dreams have? I just want to make you an example. I teach architectural history. We had a lot of discussion about sublime. Yeah, sublime. It's a period, as you probably know, in the 18th century. It did not have any specific, you know, reference to any specific object or it was a feeling. Yeah, it was an idea of being lost in nature. So I don't know, but if you use imagination and dream, the force of dreams, it doesn't come with a catalog. I find this as being very diminishing, if you don't mind. And also it's suggesting that the whole vocabulary they're proposing, it's kind of toyish. Yeah, it's a bit from I don't know, from some sort of an early, you know, I don't know. It's very personal. Let's put it this way. It's very personal. Especially when you come down to collective, you know, dream. Who knows what a collective dream is? I don't know. What is important is not to remove the mystery around dreams. Yes. Yeah, you cannot quantify them or give them. It's kind of difficult. I mean, artists have been trying to do that. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the landscape. You know, the background landscapes in Renaissance paintings. Yeah, yeah, they were you know, they were dreams. Yeah. But it's not so much the subject, it's how you present it that is giving. Again, I can go on this subject, but yeah, it seems you're limiting the whole the subject of dreams. Thank you.
Here again, I can't say for sure, but there are again just a couple of hints or elements that make me wonder if there is an ironic posture here, that there are these moments of saying, you know, our talented staff of architects will do all the work and turn your dreams into these elements that I am not sure, but I think that's intended to, we're supposed to think, what a silly idea, that surely the architects would not be, you know, they're just sitting there like watching someone's dream and going, well, I know what to do, an ionic column, like that there's a kind of send up of the premise even as you're presenting it. Am I right, Isa and Ala, that there's like, how seriously are you presenting this?
So I think the way we wanted to present this is a lot like magical realism, which is twofold. And of course, there's the element of magical realism where it presents this picture perfect. picture, but there's also the other side of it, which is the reality and the real experience and the dark side almost of magical realism, and kind of how the two can juxtapose together to create.
Because I noticed also the reference to oil, for example, like that feels like that's sort of under the surface, something darker is being expressed. That this happy dream product, like, oh, you'll sign up, you'll subscribe, we'll get your money. That's all intended to cover over that actually underneath these kind of nightmares trickle in, or that there's something sort of unconscious dissatisfaction with the whole business. For me, that's not fully developed at this moment. I agree with Giuliano that it's hard to get past the sense of these kind of modular kit of architectural parts as not resembling any dreams that I know of or have had. And so that puts up a kind of resistance in me to be like, well, this isn't much like a dream. But I feel like part of the suggestion here is that it's not really that much like a dream. It's just taking elements from dreams, and as you walk around, you're sort of confronted with these odd juxtapositions, and that this produces a reaction or produces some kind of thought. Is that closer to the mark?
Yeah, it's kind of like symbolism in magical realism, in which it's not exactly expressing the dream 100%, but it triggers something that, like an element that the person had in their dream. So they see the oil, and it makes them feel or remember what they dreamt of.
I see. I think there's a lot of provocative material here. You touch on several, you're touching on magical realism, but you also touch on the Frankfurt School by way of Krakauer and discussion of the cinema. And there, I think there's a kind of different avenue, which, again, it's been a while since I've read this stuff, but for Krakauer or for Benjamin, even for Adorno early on, things like Mickey Mouse cartoons were actually access to revolutionary potential, because you saw, a table gets up and dances, and it's sort of things that don't happen in reality, which makes you imagine new possibilities, but also shows us things outside of a market, removed from their exchange value and returned to a kind of pure world of use value and surplus use value even. And that's very different, I think, from the discussion you're making about magical realism as a way to confront a terrible present or a sort of unbearable set of social conditions.
Yes.
To sort of discuss them, but also sublimate them, maybe to return to the language of the sublime. And I think that's got tons of potential. There's also, though, the use of like the mid-1990s Macintosh graphics early in the presentation. Like, I wonder what that's meant to evoke. And then the kind of contemporary world of cartoon axons, what's that meant to evoke? And none of that's a problem, but just because you kind of ping so many signifiers, you ping surrealism by way of this kind of exquisite corpse combination of elements. Although in surrealism, there's I guess, okay, another thing to think about is the idea that the programmers and the architects, kind of take things and put them together to make the composition is interesting, but I think there's a reason why surrealism leaned so much on automatic processes like Exquisite Corpse, the sort of that you're sort of taking away authorship to create something that would not be created if someone was consciously trying to produce it, which is trying to get at how dreams work, right? Get at that this is not a conscious production. Sorry, these are disconnected thoughts. One other disconnected thought is that when you turn to Washington Heights, you say these are 3 significant sites that have some kind of meaning in local memory. And then you say that they are blank canvases on which to do the dream work. So all of these things to me say that there's something really interesting going on here that I don't think I've put together. I don't think I've fully have connected the dots of what you're doing or making happening, because I think there are deliberate mismatches. I think these are choices by you to have these things that don't quite seem to add up in the concept and the delivery. And maybe that matches the things in the dreams that don't match up, or the things in the mixed reality that don't match up with the physical reality. right now for me, it's very all over the map, maybe in a productive way, but I'm still getting to it, I think.
May I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, pardon. You know, I have some thoughts, and you know, I think I think you successfully present to me really a tension that I'm sensing. I'm of two minds of this project. One is I'm very excited by, and the other is I'm very frightened by. And really, I think what the tension you're presenting is, in my mind, the relationship between public space and really the most private thoughts, most private kind of personal thoughts mediated through social media. And, you know, as you were presenting, I thought to myself, oh, you know, this is like, you know, I really dread to do 23andMe. I think I would never do this one, right? It's like gets, you know, and then the whole Minority Report, like if I think about or dream about a crime, are they going to come arrest me? So I'm fearful of that. On the other hand, I think what's promising about this, and this is really being quite optimistic, is that this idea of seeing others' dreams or being part of it's almost like a game, almost like online gaming where decisions you make trigger other decisions. The promise of that is kind of new imagery. The kind of you know, the phenomenologists talk about the hermetic condition of just being bounded by our own senses. And I think that the abstract thought that's being discussed, the kind of symbols prior to language are really quite interesting and quite promising. I think that's why the images are so, they're compelling. I want to look at them, but they're also frightening in a certain sense. So we talk about dreams, but sometimes my dreams are nightmares. So, you know, so there is a real tension that I think you're presenting. And congratulations, it's really, really, really truly interesting work. Really hits one of my personal nerves because I'm really very aware of kind of, or try to keep track of my social media presence, and then also what I consider private. So I think it's really touching on many of those things. Thank you.
I would like to, yeah, sorry.
I would like to say a couple of things. I think it's important also to understand the difference between the medium movies, and television, and architecture. There are different experiences altogether. I just, you know, and you cannot simply transfer material that comes from the abstraction of a movie directly into. I just, you know, you seem to do it, you know, in a very mechanical way, and it's kind of strange. I can think about a Baroque, you know, garden. I'm just maybe it's time also to look back at, you know, the history of architecture a bit more, and trying to connect what you're doing a bit more to what has been the sustaining experience of architecture through time, you know, which is still there. You cannot totally deny that or forget about it. Just because. By the way, there are also different types of dreams. There's also nightmares. Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's not only this kind of idyllic, you know, little childish world that you're suggesting, and so again, it's difficult ground. It's very difficult ground, and maybe to some degree should be left open, yeah, for interpretation. I can think about a dream-like solution. Let's say an island in a lake, yeah, Baroque, where the landscape is all stepping down, you know, towards the water, so that in the midst of an early, you know, winter morning, it appears like a dragon, you know, emerging from the water. I'm just saying that. So for a moment, to recall some sort of an imagined, you know, sort of dream-like. Then the light changes, and you see the returning walls of the, you know, the garden, the step, you know, the trees and people, and then it becomes normal. You know, I don't know. Again, I just think the questions is fantastic, but in a way, you find your own way to express your thoughts, which is great because it's very difficult to even attempt that. But again, I will leave it much more open, yeah. And then let the dream be more mysterious, yeah, yes, unconscious, yeah. If you're talking about the unconscious, plays an important role in architecture, you're absolutely right, yeah. And probably interesting buildings come from far away, yes, yeah. Even from other experiences, they're not necessarily architectural ones. Sometimes fears, yeah, sense of hope. I don't know. Light, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to.
Yeah, I would like to pick up actually also on that, echoing also many of the comments. And I think, it's a really intriguing project, very provocative. It raises more questions than it answers, which I think it's actually really a good thing, a very productive thing. And it's also difficult to not just to comprehend, also to develop a critique towards the project, because it deals with very complex issues. I'm really fascinated by, your approach of magical realism, focus on the dreams, the unconscious, which of course, as others pointed out, it raises a couple of questions, a couple of problems, especially with the question of collectivity. What really does it mean, a collective dream? And then questions of agency, who really gets to decide collecting these data, who collects the data, identifying the dreams. But I would like to maybe raise something slightly different and maybe shift the discussion a little bit, because me personally, I'm actually more interested not in the content. Like, for example, from your slides, you showed the one trying to mix, you said mixed reality between the virtual reality and the actual reality. And you have the plus sign. So we have the duck and the column and the classical column, and then you have the plus sign, how bringing these two together. For me, actually, if I take your work literally, I would like to push it a little bit in a different direction. Maybe that can hopefully be productive for you. When I think of dream, I don't necessarily think in terms of the content of the dream, but going to the Freudian analysis, the dream work, which is more a force acting on the content of the dream. And even if we take more psychoanalytical approach and think of dreams not just as visual elements, but also as language, which brings the question of grammar, the syntactic aspect, and the rules, to put it simply, the rules. So if we take this literally, so what would happen if instead of just the plus sign here, you have other mathematical signs? You have multiplication, you have division, you have a subtraction. I think that's an important question, because what's is more important for me are the rules and the grammar of how these elements are brought together. So when you have the final image, or one of the, when all these virtual elements and the reality elements are brought together, for me, they are brought together in a more harmonious way. And the question will be, if we would use other mathematical operation, what would be the outcome? In other words, how bringing these invisible elements and making them visible will problematize reality, and it will not be just a harmonious coexistence with what we already know, or what already there. The other question, which brings back to the collectivity question, what if the collectivity don't agree? What if there are elements that run into clash with other elements and they don't really form a coharmonious whole? And the last question, what if there are elements that actually resist being visualized? And you cannot, no matter what, you have to try to capture everything and make it visible, that there are still elements that will escape that. So this will be my comments. But again, I think it's a fascinating project from this aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me also, what's really provoking about it is that it does try to create that, quote, magical urbanism through the lens of the VRML. So I think acting dreams during nighttime that are private and centralized through a gradient of emotions is for me personally, not something I would feel comfortable with, right? Being part of this kind of revelatory, technological, submit yourself, 24/7 to that kind of virtual limbo. But I think your thesis, ironically, actually proves that if I took the component of extracting the dreams and them coming, and you guys being the kind of the architectural gods of consolidating and fusing your data, if you thought of it reverse and simply said, look, it's all about the mundane and the ordinary. And the moment you place on the VRML goggles, you can go into the world and actually experience these dreamlike spaces while you're completely awake. But if you are inspired by the dreamlike surrealism, you could say 3 people can choose specific emotions that actually give a radically different reading to the experience of an identical existing facade, existing element. So somebody who chooses the emotion of loneliness will experience it very differently from the person who experiences happiness or joy. Or you know, I'm trying to tell you, like dreams hold and expose our emotions, and they amplify usually what we experience or what we're afraid of or what we yearn for or what we wish we could have. And often, you know, they're not, you know, they're playing with scale and they're unexpected and they're really wild. But I think you, as the authors who are setting up this framework, are actually proving to us glimpses of how an identical element, an identical view can actually perhaps set up several algorithms as to how it could be experienced during daytime, right? Like through the VRML illusion that you set up. And I think for me, I would actually use the word that's been placed on the contraband list, the blur. You know, if you think of it almost the Francis Bacon painting that shows to us, here's the ordinary image of the face, and here it is what the face starts to look like depending on what emotion you choose to experience. And this is my magical world that I'm setting up for the users of the globe. For me, that's where it really becomes, you know, extraordinary and unexpected, because you can choose what you want to experience in a way, and then you figure out through your fusion or contradiction of these highly architectural elements how those elements can actually provoke emotions that are polarized, that are different depending on what the audience chooses to use. You know, for example, University of Sydney right now is doing all these studies using VRML, where they're literally building through VRML goggles. You know, students are building physical models that they've designed virtually in real life. So I think there's a lot of, you know, what is reality, what is here, what is not, what is real, how do we experience it? But I would, you know, my advice for the, you know, and I think you've done extraordinary by your work, for the future would be to perhaps see it more as you setting up these worlds for us through the advent of technology, and not so much as something that is necessarily extracted out of our personal dreamscape. But you create the dreamscape is the way I see it, as opposed to, you know, if I dream of a duck or whatever else gets used, then becomes this other world. I think you're already creating that world even without the collection of the dreams.
I mean, it speaks somewhat to the idea of intent, and to what extent these are aggregations of information as opposed to synthetic environments that you've kind of brought a kind of more explicit intent to, so that the whole in some way is greater than the sum of its parts. I feel like any one of these images could be the source of a series of relational diagrams that have to do with where the information comes from, what you know, what the hierarchy is between that. Not to mention then how these are received by each user in terms of really complex feedback loops if you're passing through the space. I mean, there's so much going on in these to unpack that. So it's like, you know, and so that's the potential, at least, I guess, that I feel like ultimately aspects of magical realism to me seem to want to produce maybe perhaps some transcendent sense that the circumstances are there's greater kind of something gained beyond, I guess, the source of the information. So, but it's really, really interesting project, and I'm kind of beyond the limits of my my knowledge in terms of how to critique it. But if I look at it just sort of in sort of more conventional architectural terms, I guess it's the kind of hierarchy and kind of intent that I feel like could be more precisely calibrated in the project.
I would also just add
Yes.
briefly, I would love to see, I think what you really try to capture is time and evolution in time. And I think Addison in the Zoom chat has been also saying how dreams allow us to really challenge the norm and experience unexpected. There's usually no gravity, scales conflate, they change. So there's this like almost usually Alice in Wonderland experience. And I think, and usually those dreams happen to people who happen to be architects, you know, so not everybody will have these extraordinary experiences, I don't think. But again, I think if you really thought of it as you're the authors, you're the ones setting up this game, right? The code of elemental transformations. I would just encourage you to maybe also really show to us how time and evolution is being captured as well. Meaning that you could show us the ordinary and how it eventually turns into the extraordinary, which is what you have on the slide here. But there are many kind of step-by-step protocols or rules that you would go through to create that magical daytime dream world for us.
Yeah,
I have a suggestion. You know, just the subject is fantastic. Looking at your material specifically, I will look into the early postmodernism. Yeah, a few years ago, and the early work of Koolhaas, Mendini, another author, Hans Hollein, and Michael Graves, and specifically this exhibit at the Biennale in Venice, of the so-called La Strada, the street, yeah, where the architects were, you know, they were supposed to introduce some level of dysfunction, the historical, whatever, and also dreamlike, yeah, version of architectural elements, yeah, from the column, from the pediment, and all that. Even from the graphics, I see a lot of the tonalities of Michael Graves, you know, yeah, pink and light yellow and all that. So because I'm looking at the visual material. Yeah, it might be helpful to check this the early phase of postmodernism. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I think this project, both in, I guess maybe mostly in terms of the representation, but some of the setup where you bring your dream states as a catalog and then bring it back to our physical world as a set of kind of a mixed reality experience. It actually reminds me of like Gestalt psychology a little bit, because that I think I think in kind of the Gestalt therapy that, you know, the dreams are more of kind of existential messages with central self, and these messages are actively explored to bring the content of the dream back to the person's actual life, as opposed to remain at kind of parts that to be kind of dissected or constructed there. So I guess in that sense that maybe there's something there where for the end users or the user experience you guys are trying to orchestrate here, maybe it's much more about how you kind of create a series of sequences or kind of steps where the person is asked to kind of engage with these series of parts of the dream in the kind of the mixed reality world, as opposed to kind of being kind of fixated on what the dream is in of itself. I guess also another thing that I thought, just in terms of like bringing the dream back to the physical world that we inhabit, maybe also has to do with kind of reconcile trauma a little bit. Maybe that's just my personal interpretation. Is that how through reliving in these parts, we're actually able to kind of gain additional understanding of the spaces around us in a way that is actually evoked or kind of unlocked by the parts that we kind of subconsciously that subconsciously bubbled up in our dreams, so to speak. But yeah, I think that kind of even the setup as well as the ways that you're devising your narrative is super interesting, and really encourage you guys to look at those in more details.
One other reference I'd throw into your toolkit, in the historical file, would be House Rococo's Mind Expander, which you might be familiar with, the late 60s Viennese project, where you put on a crazy helmet and you see the city through like weird distorted lenses or filters, basically. And this is, part of a genre of putting on a weird helmet projects from the late 60s, but I think it was significant that they had you look through it at your normal environment. So similar to something like augmented reality, and they came out and said what they thought this would do, that essentially it's kind of a cousin of a situationist project where encountering the city through this, then when you take the thing off, because you've experienced it and it's been defamiliarized and it's been made strange, you take it off and you now see it with fresh eyes. Like you don't take the environment for granted. You notice the strangeness of the everyday world, which you had just been kind of going along in. And that's only one possible avenue, but it seems to me that it's helpful to really state, like, what do we think this would do to the people, or how would they come out changed? I think Anche's point in the chat that what would this do to collectives, or what new kinds of publics or collective engagements might come of experiencing other people's dreams in this way. I think, in other words, perhaps narrating your story from the point of view of the user as much as you're narrating it from the point of view of the company might give me a clearer glimpse into like what you're planning to do. And I understand the gesture of holding back from that, and that can be very effective, but for me, it might be helpful to have that spelled out a little bit, because I'm dumb.
I have a bit of a different question. I'm just curious how I see the use of a lot of color, and maybe this is one of these questions that's actually also too personal. But how did you decide on uses of colors, sets of colors, just to kind of get into your production methods? Or maybe that's too personal.
I think the project has always been a lot about aesthetics. I mean, it's a question that we've struggled with since the beginning because of the nature of dreams and the fact that they're so subjective to each individual. And while Isa and I may dream in these technicolor pastels, that's not always the case. And I think through the renderings is where we tried to be a little bit more kind of encompassing of different dreams and different dream atmospheres. But in the overall dream drawing, we did want to present this kind of magical, colorful, picture perfect experience, kind of, since we were approaching this from the lens of the creators or the developers, and we're kind of brushing the dark side like under the rug.
But you cannot deny that your vocabulary is historical. Yes. Again, you're in a way you're quoting very closely what the early postmodern young architects were saying, and at the beginning it appeared to be in the very intriguing way to really to kind of almost to be like a crazy enfant terrible, to reinvent neoclassical or historical elements, on this kind of new sets of paradigms within the building. So, if that can be of your interest, look at what they had to say. But again. But the material was historical, like in your case, you use columns, you use pieces from buildings from the 19th century, the arch, whatever it is. I mean, this is your own choice, and I wonder why you do that.
Yeah, we looked very closely at postmodernism. We're both really big fans of the movement, and we also really appreciate that it originated kind of in academia, and it was an agenda pushed a lot by students. And it focuses on a love of architecture, which we definitely have, but most importantly, a love for the language of architecture and its elements. And that's where we kind of found a tie with dreams and the importance of recurring elements, but not only recurring elements, but also not being afraid of exploring new assemblages with those incredibly important recurring elements, just like postmodernism did.
I just want to jump in here for 1 second because there's a comment in the chat that I think is kind of spot on for maybe just to finalize the discussion in the last 10 minutes we have, which is about not just how the dreams are made and the translation and all that, but like what is the nature of the collective engagements that occur during and even after these images, right? So someone spoke about this a little bit, that they're really temporal. That is true. Like we usually look at renders as if they're fixed and, you know, they're the ultimate building or project or whatever, but these are glimpses in time, right? These change radically while you're there, and they change radically and they go away, frankly, either when you take the goggles off or you come back, and they change all the time. And so the question really then is, what is the nature of people's engagement with each other and with the physicality, with the virtuality of the spaces as they change? And for us, I mean, you know, that's kind of a little bit at the heart of like our provocation to the students is relative to a kind of future type of publics. Anyway, so if anybody wants to pick that up, be my guest. If not, that's cool too.
Okay.
Is somebody going to pick that up? I thought, no. Well, we are actually coming to the hour, and maybe it's time to wrap up our morning session, unless anyone wants to add a comment right now. Okay. Thank you, Isa and Ali. Electric Dream Tigers, really accomplished work. Thank you to the jury. It's really, you know, this conversation has been very interesting as the project has evolved, and we really hope that it doesn't stop here. So thanks for everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. Really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone, the students and the guests.
Who is there? Hi, Jason.
Hi, Giuliano.